Dad doesn't need to do anything. He just needs to disappear from these decisions. The words were said very softly. No anger, no raised voice. They came in the middle of a quiet dinner when everything still seemed fine. I was holding my teacup when my hand froze in midair. No one looked at me. The conversation went on. Only from that moment on, it no longer called my name. That calmness was what sent a chill down my spine. I set the teacup down very slowly and straightened the tablecloth, a familiar reflex of someone who has spent a lifetime smoothing things over before they become uncomfortable. And for the first time in my life, I asked myself something very simple, yet unbearably heavy. When does a father stop being disliked and start being seen as unnecessary? Not everyone who grows old is afraid of losing money. Many of us fear something else even more. Losing our place. The feeling of still being there, still present, but no longer taken into account. If one day your children no longer need to argue with you, does that really mean peace? Maybe you're listening to this story late at night, in a familiar room, when every small sound feels louder than usual. If those questions touched a quiet space you've carried with you, stay. Before I continue, let me ask you something small. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you live right now? If this story touches something inside you, or if you think someone else needs to hear it, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay until the end. Not because there's a right answer, but because maybe we're all trying to get through a long night feeling a little less alone. And just briefly, the story you're about to hear is fictional, created with the help of AI and edited by humans to encourage reflection and learning from human experience. It is not meant to encourage imitation. What kept me awake that night was a very small realization, one that seemed harmless. But if I was right, then my silence might no longer be harmless at all. My name is Harold Whitman. I'm 69 years old, and I live in a quiet suburban town in northern Georgia, a place where you can still hear insects chirping on the porch at night, where neighbors greet each other with familiar nods, and where I've lived for more than 30 years since taking early retirement to stay close to my children. From the outside, my family has always been considered peaceful. No big arguments, no slammed doors, dinners still shared, holidays still filled with turkey, pumpkin pie, and polite toasts. But only if you live long enough under the same roof do you realize this. Some relationships don't break apart loudly. They drift little by little, slowly enough that you get used to it, gently enough that you convince yourself everything is fine. After my wife passed away, I moved in with my son's family. No one forced me. I didn't hesitate either. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. I helped drive my grandchild to school, mowed the lawn on weekends, fixed small things around the house. I was used to being the one people asked, not because I was always right, but because I was always there. Then, gradually, things changed. Not through a big event, but through very small details. Family meetings I was only told about afterward. Decisions announced quickly, as if all I needed was the outcome. I told myself the kids were busy. I told myself I was getting old, that stepping back was a good thing. And I believed it, because believing that was more comfortable. Until that dinner. After those words were spoken, I didn't object. I didn't ask questions. I stayed silent, and that silence was accepted so quickly it stunned me. No one apologized. No one explained further, as if what had been said was simply reasonable. In the days that followed, I started paying closer attention. I realized I was no longer asked about even the smallest things. A home repair was scheduled, and I only found out when the contractor was already at the door. Weekend plans were finalized first, then I was asked if I was free, as an extra option. No one meant to hurt me, and that was what made it so hard to name. One morning, I stood in the kitchen making coffee. The wall calendar had been replaced with a new one, filled with notes I hadn't written. I stared at it longer than usual, not because I didn't understand it, but because it suddenly struck me. Some changes happen so smoothly that the person most affected is the last one to know. I began asking myself what I had done wrong. I replayed my years as a father, the times I gave in, the times I stayed quiet to keep the peace, the times I chose the easiest path so no one would feel uncomfortable. I had always thought that was love, but now I began to wonder, had that easygoing nature slowly caused me to disappear? One afternoon, while cleaning out an old drawer in my room, I found a small note, my handwriting, from years ago. Something trivial, a simple reminder. I picked it up, then set it down again. It no longer belonged to the present, and in that moment, I saw it clearly. Not just objects, but my role in this house was being rearranged, quietly, neatly, without asking me. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. But from that moment on, I understood that some things, if you stay silent about them, don't preserve peace. They remove you from your own story. And I still hadn't said what I had just discovered. At least, not yet. The days that followed passed very normally, on the surface at least. In the morning, I woke early to make coffee, the smell spreading through the half-awake kitchen. I still took the trash out on Tuesday nights, still watered the lawn every evening when the sun softened. Everything was familiar enough that, at a glance, you'd think nothing had changed. But within those small routines, I began to notice a quiet shift. The household schedule changed little by little. Dinner time was no longer fixed. Some nights I waited until nearly 8 only to get a brief message saying everyone had eaten out. No one forgot about me. They just didn't think to ask me anymore. Conversations happened right there in the living room, but in voices just soft enough, just quick enough, that I couldn't step in, and couldn't accuse anyone of deliberately shutting me out. My name slowly disappeared from daily exchanges. In the past, if the fence needed fixing or the outdoor light replaced, they would call me. Now I only learned about it after everything was done. I stood there looking at the ladder leaning against the wall, the hammer placed neatly beside it, and wondered when I had missed my moment. No one said I couldn't do it anymore, but no one waited for me either. At first, I told myself it made sense. I was older. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be. My back ached on windy days. Maybe they just wanted me to rest. Thinking that way was easier. It spared me from facing the feeling of being pushed aside. Then, one afternoon, as I was watering the plants out front, a pickup truck pulled up. A man got out, wearing a uniform shirt and a baseball cap. He greeted me politely, exchanged a few casual words, then walked straight into the house. I instinctively set the hose down and stood there watching. They talked in the living room. I wasn't trying to listen, but the door was open just enough for their voices to carry. The man explained a decision related to the house, something that, for many years, had always been my responsibility. I stood still, my hands still wet, listening to every word. And I realized I was hearing about an important decision from a stranger. That moment wasn't loud. No one turned to look at me with pity. Everything went smoothly, professionally. The man nodded, wrote something down, then left. The door closed. The house returned to silence. My first reaction was to blame myself. I thought maybe I'd slowed down. Maybe I wasn't reliable anymore. I stood in the kitchen, looking at my hands, the veins raised beneath thinning skin. I remembered how strong I used to be, how many big things I'd handled without help. The thought passed quickly, leaving behind a hollow space I couldn't quite name. I paused, leaning against the kitchen counter. Old images rose up in my mind. Years when I had been the pillar, when every decision passed through me. Not because I liked control, but because I carried responsibility. Late nights calculating expenses, early mornings fixing things before work. Back then, I never thought about my role. It came as naturally as breathing. Now that role seemed to have been transferred, quietly and neatly. And what unsettled me most wasn't that it no longer belonged to me, but that it had been taken without a word. I realized something important. No one was attacking me. No one was trying to hurt me. They simply weren't waiting for me anymore. Their time moved faster, their decisions came sooner, and I, somehow, was no longer part of that orbit. My feelings tangled together. There was real relief in it. I no longer had to carry everything, no longer had to be right, but right behind that came something else, slower and sharper, like a small cut that wouldn't heal. Relief from letting go, hurt from no longer being held. That night I didn't say anything. I chose silence, thinking it was the most loving option. I didn't want to make things heavy. I didn't want to become the difficult father who always feels left out. I told myself that staying quiet was maturity, was generosity, that if I didn't speak up, things would continue peacefully. But that silence didn't vanish. It took shape. It crept into meals, into conversations, into the hours I spent alone in the living room without anyone noticing. I became more cautious in everything I did, as if afraid of disturbing a rhythm that no longer revolved around me. One night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I sat in the dark with only a desk lamp on. I thought about my choices, about whether silence was truly love, or just another way of avoiding change. I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew one thing for sure. From that moment on, my silence was no longer neutral. It was creating distances I hadn't fully imagined, and I sensed that if this continued, those distances wouldn't stay emotional. They would lead to real consequences, things that wouldn't be easy to undo, even if I spoke up later. After that night, I began doing something I didn't recognize at first. I started shrinking myself. No one asked me to. No new words triggered it. It happened naturally, like a reflex. I stopped standing in the kitchen during busy hours. I waited until everyone finished eating before making my own coffee. I stopped asking about weekend plans. I avoided moments that might pull me into shared decisions. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't want to become in the way. Tasks that had once been part of my daily routine suddenly felt unnecessary. I no longer checked the mailbox first. I stopped calling repairmen. I stopped reminding anyone of small details I had once seen as my responsibility. Everything seemed to run smoothly without me. And instead of reassuring me, that realization made me feel like I was standing outside a familiar machine. One morning, I stood in the shed, looking at the lawnmower hanging on the wall. In the past, I would have taken it down without thinking. That day, I paused. I wondered whether I should ask first. The thought came so quickly it startled me. Ask who? And for what? I had always been the one who decided these things. Now I stood there, hesitating like a guest in my own home. In the end, I went inside, found my son, and asked a very small, very gentle question. Should I mow the lawn today? I spoke as casually as I could, but his reaction made me stop short. He looked at me, slightly surprised, as if I'd asked something unnecessary. Not annoyed, just surprised. That moment lasted less than a second, but it was enough to make my face burn. I nodded, said, "It's fine," and turned away. Inside me, an uncomfortable feeling rose. Not sharp, but persistent. Embarrassment, then insecurity. I wondered when I had started needing permission for things that used to be mine. I went back to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. My memory pulled me backward, years when the whole family gathered around the table, waiting for me to say what came next. Big and small decisions passed through me, not because I liked leading, but because I carried responsibility. Back then, I never thought of myself as being needed. I just thought I was doing my part. Now, those memories warmed me and hurt me at the same time. Warm because I knew I had once mattered. Painful because I could see that place was gone. I began to understand that in trying not to make things uncomfortable for others, I was slowly removing myself from spaces that had once been mine. I didn't voice these thoughts. I kept choosing silence. I told myself I was adapting, that this was a natural transition of aging. I practiced smiling more, saying, "That's fine," more quickly. I became deliberately easygoing, and deep down, I knew I was doing it so no one would feel awkward about not needing me. What was frightening was that no one resisted this shrinking. No one said, "Dad, you don't have to do that." No one noticed I was pulling back. Everything was too smooth. My absence was accepted so quickly that it became convenient, and that convenience sent a chill through me. Another afternoon, I sat alone in the living room, late sunlight slanting through the window. Laughter drifted in from the kitchen, but no one called me. I wasn't pushed away. I simply wasn't invited. I looked around the familiar room, the family photos on the walls, the memories I once believed would keep me at the center. And I understood something, faint but unmistakable. My disappearance was being treated as practical. That realization didn't strike like a shock. It arrived slowly, like cold air slipping through a crack. I didn't yet know what to do with it. I only knew that if I kept shrinking like this, I would soon become part of the background, always there, but no longer seen. That morning began like any other. I woke up before everyone else, made coffee, and stood by the window watching the thin mist still clinging to the grass. In that quiet moment, I still thought I could go on living like this, smaller, a little quieter, and that everything would eventually be fine. But near midday, a situation came up that forced me to speak, even though I hadn't prepared myself for it. They were discussing rearranging the back room, the space I had always used as my repair corner. I heard chairs scraping, papers rustling, then short, efficient exchanges. I stood in the hallway, listening long enough to understand that the decision was almost final. No one called me over, but I knew it involved me. At least, I used to think it did. I stepped into the living room and stopped at the doorway. I didn't interrupt. I just said one very soft sentence, almost hesitant, suggesting that maybe a small detail should be considered, something I knew well from having used that room for many years. I spoke slowly, chose my words carefully, tried to keep my tone neutral. Not to claim authority, just to remind them that I was still here. The response I received made me freeze. It was very polite, no raised voice, no irritation, but it was also very firm. They thanked me, said they had already taken everything into account, and told me not to worry because it would all be handled. The tone was so gentle that I couldn't push back without sounding unnecessary. The conversation went on as if I had offered a comment that didn't need to be followed up. In that moment, I felt myself lose weight, not pushed out, but falling freely in a space where there was no longer anything holding me. I stood there for a few more seconds, then quietly turned away. No one stopped me. No one called my name. And it was that smoothness that left me feeling empty. The man wasn't driven away. He simply was no longer invited into the story of his own life, and that was when everything began to drift off its old course. I went back to my room, closed the door, and sat down on the old chair by the window. The room was so quiet I could clearly hear the wall clock ticking. I wasn't angry, at least not in the way people usually mean by anger. I didn't feel heat rushing through me. I was just confused, a floating feeling as if I had missed a step on the stairs and no one noticed. I thought back over the years. All the times I chose to soften my words, to give way, to stay silent, to keep the peace. I had believed kindness meant putting others first, that if I didn't make things awkward, people would appreciate it. But now a question began to form, slowly but clearly. What was I giving up to keep that peace? The question didn't come with an immediate answer. It just sat there in my head, heavy. I looked around the room at the familiar objects I had arranged and repaired myself. I realized that over time, my kindness had turned into a convenient empty space for others to fill. No one meant to take advantage, but they also had no reason to stop. The afternoon passed in silence. I didn't go out. I didn't look for anything to do. I just sat there, letting the feeling exist. For the first time in days, I didn't try to push it aside. I let myself feel the confusion, the letdown, and the vague fear that if things continued like this, I would slowly disappear from important decisions, not because I was no longer capable, but because I had grown too used to stepping back on my own. When the sun began to set and the light in the room turned pale gold, I stood up. I looked at myself in the mirror, older than I remembered, but the eyes were still there, the eyes of someone who once knew who he was. I took a deep, slow breath. I didn't yet know what I would do next, but I knew I couldn't go on the same way. That night, I didn't say anything else, but in my mind, a very small, very quiet decision had already taken shape. I would try doing something different, not to confront anyone, not to compete, but to see what would happen if I stopped using kindness as a way to erase myself. That decision was spoken out loud on a Saturday afternoon when I was in the kitchen washing the last coffee mug. I heard voices coming from the living room, steady, confident, as if everything had already been agreed on. They were talking about signing a new service contract for the house, a long-term maintenance package, not inexpensive, tied to many conditions. In the past, things like that always went through me. Not because I liked control, but because I understood every corner of this house, every winter that cracked the wood, every summer that pushed the air conditioner to its limit. This time, my name wasn't mentioned. I stood still for a few seconds, my hands still wet. The familiar feeling came back, the feeling of being inside my own home while standing on the porch. I could have stayed silent like always. I was very good at that. But something inside me shifted, quietly, without force, just a clear nudge. Not this time. I walked into the living room, wiped my hands on a towel. I didn't interrupt. I waited for a natural pause, then spoke. My voice was so calm it surprised even me. I said I didn't agree with that decision, that there were details that needed to be reviewed, and that I wanted to be part of the discussion before any signatures were put down. Just one word. No. Said gently, without a long explanation. No anger, no sarcasm. The room seemed to stall. No one shouted. No one pushed back harshly. But I saw eyes shift, heard very soft, deep breaths. Someone asked again, politely, whether I was sure. I nodded. That certainty didn't come from believing I was absolutely right, but from knowing I had the right to say it. Their reaction made me pause. Not anger, but surprise, as if they had just heard an unexpected sound from something that was usually silent. I realized how used I had become to nodding, to giving in, to the point that when I stayed still and said no, it felt unusual. The atmosphere in the room changed, subtly. The conversation continued, but it was no longer as smooth as before. Words were chosen more carefully. Small pauses appeared, pauses that hadn't existed before. I sat there, back straight, hands resting on my knees, trying not to take back what I had just said. My heart beat faster, but I kept my expression steady. In that moment, I looked back at myself. I tried to remember the last time I had set a clear boundary. It had been a long time. Maybe since the day I started believing that love meant making things easier for others. I had bent myself around the needs of those around me for so long that I had forgotten my original shape. No one raised their voice, but the quiet now carried a different weight. I felt a quiet wave of guilt rise up. A part of me whispered that I was making things harder, that I was disturbing the calm I had worked so hard to preserve. I felt the urge to apologize, to add that I didn't mean to cause trouble. But I didn't say anything. I let the silence stand. And in that silence, a new understanding began to form. I started to see that boundaries, even when spoken in the calmest voice, can still make others uncomfortable. Not because they're wrong, but because they change habits. And I also understood that the guilt I felt didn't come from doing something wrong, but from a deeper fear. I was afraid of losing my role. I was afraid that if I was no longer easygoing, no longer the one who always said, "That's fine," I would no longer be needed. I was afraid that my value in this family was tied to the convenience I provided. Realizing that tightened my chest. But at the same time, it brought a rare clarity. The discussion ended without an immediate conclusion. The decision was put on hold. When everyone drifted away, I stayed seated a little longer. No one said anything else to me, but no one ignored me either. I sensed a very small shift in how they looked at me. Not hostility, but caution. That night when the house was quiet, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I thought about the word "no" I had said. It hadn't broken the world. It hadn't made anyone leave, but it had exposed something I had avoided for a long time. I had traded my boundaries to hold on to a role I was afraid to lose, and maybe that fear itself was what had been making me slowly disappear. I didn't know where things would go from there, but for the first time in a long while, I felt my feet touch the ground, not to confront anyone, but to stand steady. After I said that, no storm followed. No one blamed me. No one pulled me aside to argue it out. Everything continued, on the surface, even calmer than before. But that calm unsettled me. It felt like walking into a familiar room and realizing the furniture was still there. Only my place had been shifted to a corner without anyone bothering to tell me. In the days that followed, I noticed the change wasn't in words, but in rhythm. Conversations still happened around me, but they no longer flowed toward me. When I entered a room, people still greeted me, still polite, but the conversation often wrapped up more quickly, or shifted to another topic, as if an invisible line had been drawn. I wasn't criticized for objecting. No one brought up the old issue again, but I also wasn't asked for my opinion anymore. My presence became neutral, not bothersome, but not necessary. To me, that hurt more than an outright accusation. One morning, as I was getting ready to go out, I heard an offhand remark drift from the kitchen. Someone said this matter didn't need to be run by me, because I didn't like dealing with complicated things. The comment was said lightly, like an objective observation, but it hit me like a cold stone. I stopped, my hand gripping the doorknob, feeling my heart sink. In that moment, I understood that my position had been redefined. Not through a clear conversation, but through quiet assumptions. I had become the one who didn't want to be involved in decisions, the one who needed to be spared the trouble. And maybe I had helped create that image myself through years of silence. The emotion came fast, stronger than I expected. Not anger, but real hurt. A deep, quiet pain that tightened my throat. I didn't say anything. I closed the door behind me, stepped outside, and took a deep breath. The morning air was cool, but my chest felt hot. I walked for a long time that day. The familiar streets, the houses I had passed hundreds of times, suddenly felt distant. I asked myself what I had been protecting all this time. Surface-level calm, or the fear that if I spoke up too much, I would lose my place in this family. Not all wounds come from words. Some wounds come from no one needing you to speak anymore, and they are much harder to heal. I came home in the late afternoon. Everything was the same. No one asked where I had been, and no one avoided me. I realized I was standing before a quiet but important choice: to stay the way I had been, gentle without ripples, or to find another way to be present without slowly disappearing. That night, I didn't react. I didn't bring up the comment. I didn't confront anyone. I just observed. observed how everyone arranged their lives without needing me. And in that observation, a slow determination took shape. I began preparing for a different choice, not leaving right away and not confronting anyone head-on, but changing the way I stayed. I didn't yet know exactly what I would do, but I knew one thing. If I kept being present in a way that made me invisible, this coldness wouldn't stop here. It would spread quietly until I no longer recognized myself. That night, I lay awake for a long time. The guilt I used to feel was gone. In its place was a clear, sober awareness. I understood that my silence had once been a choice, and now I needed a different one, a way to stay without trading away my own existence. I didn't leave, but I also stopped trying to blend in the way I used to. The decision came quietly, without fanfare. It wasn't a declaration, but more like stepping away from places that had always made me shrink. I began living at my own pace, waking up a little earlier, walking a little longer. I drank my coffee on the back porch instead of sitting in the kitchen waiting for someone to ask what I wanted. I read the newspaper slowly, without paying attention to what was being discussed inside the house. I wasn't avoiding anyone, and I wasn't on edge. I simply allowed myself to exist without needing to prove it. At first, the changes were so small no one noticed. I still greeted people, still answered when asked, but I stopped inserting myself. Not out of fear, but because I no longer felt the need. Things I had always attended before, family meetings, discussions that once felt mandatory, I now let pass without guilt. The moment everyone noticed the difference came on a weekday evening. Something that had always been considered a given for me, a quick meeting about the upcoming schedule, happened without me. Not because they forgot to ask, but because I had already said I had something else planned that night. When I came home, the house felt unusually quiet. I caught faint questioning looks, as if someone was debating whether to ask where I had been. I hung up my coat, washed my hands, did everything slowly. No one said anything. And that silence spoke volumes. Their reaction surprised me. Not anger, not reproach, but confusion, as if they had just realized a familiar piece was no longer in its usual place. I felt myself being looked at differently, not as someone who needed care, and not as someone who was always on call, but as someone with his own schedule. That night, lying in bed, I looked back on the road I had taken. I realized that for many years I had used sacrifice as a way to hold on to my role. I believed that if I was always there, always giving in, I would be needed. But the cost of being needed that way was shrinking myself, blurring my own needs. And then, when I stopped doing that, a new feeling appeared. Relief. Not explosive happiness, but a lightness in my chest, as if I had finally set down a heavy bag I'd been carrying for so long that I'd forgotten what empty hands felt like. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. Not because I was cold, but because I no longer felt the need to justify having a life of my own. I understood that any further explanation at that point could be taken as a demand, or worse, an accusation, and I wanted neither. The atmosphere in the family changed in a different way, not more tense, but no longer peacefully smooth as before. New gaps appeared, gaps left by me no longer always being available. At first, those gaps made people uneasy. Then they began filling them in their own ways. And I realized that the world didn't fall apart when I wasn't present for everything. It was both painful and freeing. Painful because it confirmed that I was no longer at the center of decisions the way I once had been. Freeing because it showed me that I didn't need to be at the center to have value. I began to feel my personal boundaries more clearly. Not tall walls, but soft lines, enough for me to know where I ended and where others began. I learned to say, "I'll think about it," instead of, "That's fine." I learned to let a question pass without feeling responsible for answering it right away. At times, this change made other people uncomfortable. I could see it in passing looks, in half-finished sentences, but I also saw something else beginning to take shape. Respect, even if it wasn't complete yet. Not respect that came from me being easygoing, but respect that came from me being clear. One morning, as I was tying my shoes and getting ready to go out, someone asked where I was going. I answered simply, "No further explanation." The question stopped there, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to soften the air. I understood that staying this way wouldn't please everyone, but I also understood that if I didn't stay on my own terms, I would continue to fade inside this very house. That choice wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with applause, but it gave me something I had lost a long time ago, the feeling that I was living, not just existing. And in the quiet of the days that followed, I knew that boundaries were not a rejection of love. They were the only way to love without losing myself. I made that decision on a very ordinary morning. There was no argument beforehand, no pressure. I simply woke up, sat on the edge of the bed, and realized I no longer wanted to ask permission for my own existence. I decided I would set aside a few days each week for something personal, a community class I had missed out on years earlier. It wasn't a big deal, not a long trip, not something that would turn the whole household upside down. But it was mine. The class schedule overlapped with some family routines that had always been taken for granted as times when I would be present. In the past, that alone would have made me hesitate. This time, it didn't. I shared that decision at lunch. My voice was steady, neither raised nor lowered. I didn't give a long explanation. I simply said I had signed up and would start next week. The room went quiet for a few seconds. No one stopped me. No one objected. But I clearly saw the surprise flash quickly. In their eyes, in the way one person set their spoon down more slowly than usual. Someone asked me, almost out of habit, "Are you sure, Dad?" This time, I didn't smile it off. I didn't say, "Let me see." I answered firmly, gently but clearly, "Yes." In that moment, I felt two opposing emotions at once, fear and calm. Fear, because I was stepping out of a familiar role, the role of the person who always adjusted to other people's schedules. Calm, because for the first time in a long while, I didn't need to consider whether my decision would make anyone uncomfortable. I only knew it was right for me at this moment. After lunch, I went out for a walk. The streets were the same, the trees still standing there, but something inside me had shifted. I looked back at the person I had been for years, someone who always asked before acting, always waited for unspoken approval. I realized I hadn't changed out of anger, but out of exhaustion from having to ask permission just to live at my own pace. There was no punishment. No one cut off contact. No one blamed me. Life went on. But between us, a new distance formed. Not cold, but healthier. A distance that allowed me not to be everywhere, and allowed others to take responsibility for their own parts. In the days that followed, I noticed I was being seen differently. Not with suspicion and not with pity, but with the look of someone adjusting to a new version of me, a person who didn't need approval to exist. There were fewer questions. Decisions were made without me, and strangely enough, I no longer felt abandoned. I felt something important being returned to me, the right to choose. I came to understand something that surprised me. This change didn't come from me becoming rigid or closed off. It came from clarity. When I was clear about what I wanted and what I could no longer keep doing, others began to adjust how they treated me. Not because they feared me, but because they knew where I stood. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave for my first class, someone asked if I would be home late. I answered. No one added anything else. The conversation ended there. And in that simplicity, I felt a new kind of respect. Quiet, but real. That night I sat in the classroom among strangers, listening to a lecture on a subject I had once loved. The fluorescent lights were evenly bright, the smell of new paper mixed with coffee. I listened, took notes, and realized I was smiling. Not because of the lesson itself, but because of the feeling of fully being present in a place I had chosen. On the way home, it was already dark. I walked slowly, without rushing. I thought about the path I had taken, from silent endurance to saying no, to living at my own pace. Nothing had happened overnight. There was no heroic moment, just small decisions, one after another, enough to change direction. I understood that boundaries weren't what made people drift away. Vagueness was. When I stopped asking permission to exist, I didn't lose my family. I only lost one version of myself, the version that always stood in the background, waiting to be called. And in the quiet of that night, I knew what I had done wasn't selfish. It was necessary, not to go against anyone, but to stay with myself. That conversation happened when the house had settled into the slow breathing of night. No one planned it. I was washing the teapot when I heard footsteps stop behind me. Someone asked if I was still awake, their voice low and cautious. I nodded, dried my hands, and the two of us sat down at the kitchen table, the place where, for years, so many small and big things had been spoken or quietly let pass. The warm light fell onto the wooden table, highlighting fine scratches, marks left by time. The air between us wasn't heavy, but it wasn't light either. It felt like the moment when the wind first shifts. Not raining yet, but enough for you to know something is about to change. We spoke slowly, short sentences. Someone remarked that I had been different lately, that they couldn't tell what I was thinking anymore. I listened, then replied calmly that I was learning to live at my own pace. I didn't explain at length. I simply placed the sentence on the table and let it sit there. Then a small, honest admission slipped out, that they had grown used to me always being there, so used to it that they hadn't noticed when I slowly pulled back. The words didn't come with an apology. They carried genuine surprise, like noticing a familiar object had been shifted slightly, and suddenly realizing you'd been misjudging its position for a long time. That admission touched me more deeply than anything else. I stayed quiet for a few seconds, took a sip of still hot tea. Then I said I didn't blame anyone. I wasn't trying to return to my old role either. I said I needed to be present because I chose to be, not because of habit or expectations formed long ago. As I spoke, I clearly saw my younger self, a man who believed his value came from how useful he was. I had once wanted to be needed to make sure I still had a place in this family. I had used availability as a way to prove I deserved to stay. Only now did I understand I had mixed up two very different things: being loved and being used. The conversation continued without escalating. No conclusion was written down, but I felt a subtle adjustment, like someone turning down a volume knob that had been set too high for years. Everything felt less harsh, easier to hear, not perfect, but real. After that, we sat a little longer, not saying much. I watched the steam rise softly from the teapot, warmth spreading down my throat. There was no explosive moment, just the ground beneath me trembling lightly, then slowly settling. In the days that followed, life didn't return to the way it had been. But it didn't fall apart either. Everyone adjusted their position, very slowly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with long silences. I no longer felt pushed to the edge. I also didn't try to force my way back to the center. I stood where I fit, somewhere I could breathe. I realized that family isn't a fixed block. It changes with age, with circumstances, with the small choices repeated every day. I didn't lose my family. What left was an old illusion, that I had to keep sacrificing myself to stay, that my presence only had value when it was convenient for others. When that illusion dissolved, I didn't become lonely. On the contrary, I stayed in a more honest way. I no longer waited to be called. I called myself into small decisions, when to join, when to step back. I didn't feel affection fade because of it. It simply stopped being distorted. Another evening, I sat on the back porch, watching the light from inside spill across the yard. Laughter, the clink of dishes, familiar sounds drifted out. I didn't go in right away, not because I wasn't invited, but because I knew I had a choice. In that choice, I found a new sense of peace. Quiet, but solid. I know this story doesn't have a perfectly rounded ending. Relationships that last a lifetime rarely do, but I also know I've crossed into a different place, one where I no longer live to fill other people's gaps, but to fill myself. And with that awareness, I'm ready to step into the next part of my life. No announcements, no promises, just a steady step forward, clear enough that I won't lose my way again. I stay in my own life in a very different way than before. There was no applause to mark that moment. No morning when I woke up and suddenly everything was fine. Just day by day, I realized I was no longer stretching myself just to be needed. I stopped measuring my value by how busy I was or how often my name came up in other people's decisions. I live a little slower now, but more steadily. Some mornings, I sit by the window with a still warm cup of coffee, watching the light slide across the tabletop. I don't think about who I need to help today, or what I need to make up for. I think about what I want to do with the time I have left in my life. That question used to make me feel selfish. Now it makes me feel honest. I no longer try to be needed at all costs. I still care, still listen, still show up when I choose to show up, but I stopped trading my inner peace to keep the outside calm. I learned to let others carry their own responsibilities and to keep my own life in my hands. That hasn't made me more distant. It has simply made me clearer. From everything I've lived through, I've come to a very simple understanding, not meant to impose on anyone, that there are times in life when the most important thing we need to do isn't to fix others, but to adjust our own position. When I stand in the wrong place, every relationship becomes heavy. When I stand in the right place, not everything is perfect, but it becomes real. I no longer see boundaries as coldness. To me, boundaries are a form of self-respect. They are the thin lines that help me know where I end, so I don't dissolve into other people's expectations. When I hold those boundaries, I don't love less. I love in the right place, and I also give others the chance to love me in a healthier way. I don't conclude who is right or wrong. I don't see my choice as an answer for everyone. It's simply my choice, at this age, in this situation. Others will choose differently, and that deserves respect too. I only know that for me, staying in my own life, fully, is the most necessary thing I can do. This is a fictional story, inspired by everyday situations and deeply human experiences. The content is supported by AI and edited and refined by humans, with the intention of offering reflection and emotional value to the audience. The story does not encourage anyone to imitate specific actions within it, but rather invites viewers to look inward, to listen to the quiet movements inside themselves, and to find a way of living that fits who they are. If there is a small gift this story can leave behind, perhaps it is the right to exist fully, not as a role or an obligation, but as a human being with a rhythm, needs, and limits of their own. That gift doesn't need to be given by anyone else. It can begin with allowing yourself. If you're listening to this story late at night, from a familiar city or somewhere far away, I'd like to ask where you are and what time it is right now. Thank you for staying until the end. That means you've given this story and yourself a precious moment of quiet. If there was a part that touched a long night you once lived through, you're welcome to share it in the comments. Maybe your story will help someone else feel a little less alone. If this video gave you something, a thought, a feeling, or simply companionship, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications as a way of supporting more stories to be told. Your presence here truly matters.